Story 1. The night was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath my feet. I had just finished washing the last of the dishes, wiping down the counters, and preparing to take out the trash when something peculiar caught my eye, a small slip of paper jutting out from the top of the garbage bag. At first, I thought nothing of it. Just another crumpled receipt, a forgotten remnant of the week's errands. But something about it made me pause. The store name was unfamiliar, the location unknown. And the items listed? A set of high-end kitchen tools, a fitness tracker, a sleek new phone case, none of which I owned or had any desire to buy. My stomach twisted as my eyes landed on the date, yesterday. I hadn't been to that store. In fact, I had barely left the house except for a quick grocery run. My pulse quickened, my fingers tightening around the receipt as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. A mistake, maybe. A receipt stuck to my shoe, a mix-up in the trash. But the explanation didn't fit. Dread curled in my gut as I hurried to my computer, pulling up my bank account, half expecting to see unauthorized transactions. But there was nothing. No charges, no unfamiliar purchases. The relief I felt was fleeting. If I hadn't bought these things, if my account was untouched, then how had the receipt ended up in my trash? The thought lodged itself in my brain, a splinter I couldn't remove. I scoured the house, checking every door, every window. Still locked. Still secure. Nothing disturbed. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the scrap of paper in my trembling hands, the numbers and letters blurring together. I needed answers. I called the store, hoping for clarity, praying for a simple explanation. The voice on the other end was polite but firm. The purchase had been made, processed, and finalized. There were no errors, no cancellations. The transaction existed just as it was printed. I hung up, unease settling deep in my bones. Someone had made this purchase. Someone had discarded the receipt. And somehow, some way, it had ended up in my trash. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every sound in the house felt amplified, every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. I double-checked the locks. I kept my phone within reach. My mind raced through possibilities. Was someone watching me? Playing a cruel joke? Testing how much they could infiltrate my life without me noticing? Then, 3 nights later, the phone rang. The number was blocked. I hesitated before answering, my fingers cold against the device. A silence stretched for several seconds, a breath held just long enough to unnerve me. Then a voice, calm, measured, familiar in a way I couldn't quite place. "I see you found the receipt." My breath hitched. The voice wasn't hurried. It wasn't threatening. It was worse than that. It was steady, controlled, like they knew something I didn't. "You'll be seeing more soon. Don't worry. Everything's fine." Then the line went dead. A slow, paralyzing chill crawled up my spine. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I stared at the phone, at the blank screen, at my own reflection in the black glass. My hands were shaking. It wasn't over. Days passed, but the unease never left. Then, the small things started happening, barely noticeable at first. A book out of place. A cabinet door left slightly ajar. My shoes, misaligned in the hallway. Little shifts in my world that could have been my own forgetfulness, but deep down, I knew better. Then another receipt appeared. Same store. Different items. Another date. Yesterday. The realization sunk in like lead in my stomach. This wasn't random. This wasn't a prank. Someone was pulling the strings of my reality, altering the fabric of my everyday life in subtle, terrifying ways. And the worst part? I had no idea what they wanted. Or when they'd make their next move. Story 2. The night had settled in, draping my home in the quiet comfort of solitude. After a long, exhausting day, I had finally allowed myself to sink into my couch, the dim glow of a single lamp casting flickering shadows along the walls. The television murmured in the background, but I wasn't really watching. My mind drifted in that liminal space between awareness and exhaustion. Then, the doorbell rang. The sharp chime cut through the silence, jarring me from my daze. My breath caught in my throat as I sat there, frozen. I wasn't expecting anyone. Who would come at this hour? For a long moment, I just listened, straining to hear anything beyond the rhythmic thudding of my heart. The house was still. Too still. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe someone needed directions. A perfectly reasonable explanation. And yet, I hesitated. I pushed myself up, my legs suddenly reluctant to move, and made my way to the door. Slowly, cautiously, I peered through the peephole. A man stood there. He was in his early 30s, his hair slightly unkempt, his jacket zipped up despite the mild weather. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, and he shifted from foot to foot, his gaze flicking downward, then back up toward the door as if waiting, no, calculating. Something about his posture made me uneasy. There was no immediate distress in his face, no urgency, just something else. Something I couldn't quite place. I hesitated, fingers grazing the doorknob. Then, against my better judgment, I unlocked it, but only slightly, cracking the door just enough to see him clearly. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice calm, though a slight tremor betrayed him. "I'm in a bit of a bind. My car broke down a few blocks away, and I need to call a tow truck. My phone's dead, and I don't have any service." I followed his gesture toward the street. His car was there, parked just beyond my driveway. The headlights were on. The engine was running. A chill crawled up my spine. Why was the engine running if the car had broken down? I looked back at him. His eyes were watching me closely, measuring my reaction. I swallowed hard. Something was wrong. I don't think I can help," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. His lips pressed together in a tight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'd really appreciate it. It'll just take a second." I shook my head. "I'm sorry." For a moment, he just stood there, unmoving. The air between us thickened. Then, something shifted. It was subtle, but I felt it, the stiffening of his shoulders, the way his fingers flexed within his pockets. His expression remained neutral, but I could sense the change. "That's fine," he said, stepping back, his voice a touch colder now. "Sorry for disturbing you." I shut the door immediately, the bolt sliding into place with a satisfying click. My pulse pounded in my ears. I turned away from the door, but something made me stop. The sensation of being watched. Slowly, I moved toward the window, careful to part the curtains just enough to see. He was still there. Not knocking. Not leaving. Just standing. Staring. Not at the door. Not at me. But at something down the street. A shiver traced its way down my spine. My fingers tightened around my phone. Should I call the police? What would I even say? Then, without warning, the night erupted with the high-pitched screech of tires. I whipped my head back toward the window just in time to see his car, his supposedly broken-down car, peel away from the curb, tires burning rubber as it sped down the street. The engine roared as he disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the darkness. My breath hitched. My hands trembled. I locked every window. Checked every door. Again and again. For the rest of the night, I barely moved from the couch, my body tense, my ears straining for any sound, any hint of a return. But the night remained quiet. The next morning, I stepped outside, my eyes scanning the street. No sign of him. No sign of his car. As if he had never been there at all. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that if I had opened that door just a little wider, if I had let him step inside. I might not have been there either. Story 3. The day had started like any other. The office was locked just as I always left it, the small silver key resting safely in my pocket. As I stepped out for lunch, I took one last glance back, reassured by the sight of the closed door. The walk to the cafe was uneventful, the midday sun casting long shadows along the pavement. I enjoyed my meal, taking comfort in the brief respite from work. But when I returned, something was wrong. The moment I reached the door, my breath caught in my throat. The lock was still in place, the keyhole undisturbed, but the door itself was open. Not just ajar, not slightly nudged, fully open, like an invitation, or worse, a warning. My heart pounded in my chest. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. And yet, there it was, gaping like a silent mouth, waiting. I hesitated, listening for any sound from within. The building was empty, too empty. The stillness pressed against my ears, an oppressive quiet that made my skin prickle. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The office was exactly as I had left it. My desk, my chair, my papers, nothing had been touched. No drawers rummaged through, no files strewn about. The eerie normalcy made it worse. It was as though nothing had happened at all. But the door had been open. And that meant something. I checked everything, my computer, my personal belongings, the window, but there was no sign of forced entry. No footprints on the carpet. No misplaced objects. And yet, a feeling of unease crawled up my spine, settling deep into my bones. Someone had been here. I was sure of it. But why leave no trace? I convinced myself it was a fluke. Maybe I hadn't locked the door properly. Maybe a gust of wind had pushed it open, though that made little sense in a building where the air was always still. Shaking it off, I forced myself back to work, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. The next morning, I arrived early, half expecting to find the door open again. But it was locked, just as I had left it. Everything was exactly in place, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even when I was alone. For days, I double-checked the door every time I left. It never opened on its own again, until the fourth day. When I returned from lunch, the door stood open, waiting for me. This time, something was missing. A file. Just one. I scoured the office, checking under my desk, inside cabinets, even in the trash. But it was gone. And that was what terrified me the most, someone had been inside. They hadn't taken money, or electronics, or anything of value. Just a single, insignificant file. Why? That night, I stayed late. I needed to understand what was happening. I changed the lock, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was for peace of mind. But even then, the silence was suffocating. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of paper sent my pulse racing. My own office felt foreign, as though it no longer belonged to me. The next morning, I made a decision: I would check the security footage. I watched the hallway feed, scanning through the hours. My stomach clenched when I reached the moment I had left for lunch. At first, nothing happened. And then, the door moved. Slowly, deliberately, it creaked open. But there was no one there. I replayed it again. And again. The footage was grainy, but unmistakable. The door had opened by itself. No hand. No shadow. Just the slow, inevitable pull of something unseen. My breath turned shallow. My hands trembled over the keyboard. How? How was this possible? I had locked it. The footage showed no one entering or exiting. No rational explanation. From that moment on, the feeling of being watched never left me. The air in the office seemed heavier, the silence more oppressive. Every time I turned my back, I imagined something just out of sight. The missing file was never found. And nothing else ever disappeared. But the door, sometimes, I would return to find it open, waiting. As if whatever was inside was waiting for me, too. Story 4. The night was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that settles deep into your bones and makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I sat on my couch, bathed in the soft, bluish glow of my phone screen, scrolling through social media without really seeing anything. Outside, the wind barely stirred the trees, and the only sound inside was the faint hum of the refrigerator. It had been an uneventful evening, nothing out of the ordinary. Just another lonely night in my house, the same routine as always. But then, my phone vibrated in my hand. The sudden buzz made my fingers tighten instinctively around the device. My heart kicked up a notch, and I glanced down. A notification from my security camera app. Movement detected in your backyard. A cold prickle crawled up my spine. I lived alone. No pets, no roommates, no reason for movement outside. My mind instantly went to logical explanations: a stray cat, the wind, maybe a neighbor's dog had wandered too far. But something in my gut told me this was different. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the notification, my pulse pounding against my ribs. Slowly, I opened the app, and the live feed flickered onto my screen. At first, everything looked normal. The yard was dark, illuminated only by the pale glow of the motion sensor light. The camera's grainy night vision cast an eerie, distorted quality over everything. My heart was still racing, but I exhaled, about to turn off the app when something moved. A shadow glided across the screen, slow and deliberate. Not an animal. Not some swaying tree branch. A person. The figure stood at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the camera's clarity. Their posture was unnatural, too still, too rigid, like they were waiting. Watching. My breath hitched. They weren't walking toward my house, at least not yet. Instead, they swayed slightly, almost lazily, testing the space around them. I wanted to believe it was just a prank. Maybe some teenager messing around. Maybe a drunk neighbor who had wandered onto the wrong property. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't random. A deep, primal fear settled into my stomach. I could feel it in the way my fingers trembled against my phone screen. My neighborhood was quiet, too quiet for someone to be creeping around at this hour. I forced my shaking hands to dial 911. The moment the operator answered, I kept my voice low, barely above a whisper, as if the figure could hear me through the walls. "There's someone in my backyard," I said, my throat dry. The operator's voice was calm, reassuring, telling me officers were on their way. But every second stretched unbearably long. I couldn't look away from the screen. The figure started moving again. Not toward my house. Not away from it. Just pacing. Slow, deliberate steps. A rhythm, like they were waiting for something, or deciding. Then they stopped. And turned their head. Not completely. Just enough that the faintest glint of their eyes caught the camera's dim light. My stomach twisted into knots. They knew I was watching. Even though it was impossible, even though there was no way for them to see me through that tiny, unblinking lens, it felt like they were staring directly into my eyes. I clamped a hand over my mouth, fighting back a strangled noise of fear. I was trapped inside my own home, powerless except to watch this nightmare unfold. My legs felt heavy, frozen in place, but I forced myself to move, locking doors, checking windows, making sure every possible way inside was sealed shut. When I looked back at the feed, the figure was still there. But something had changed. They were holding something. A small, indistinct object, raised up as if to show the camera. I squinted, but the darkness swallowed the details. Whatever it was, they wanted me to see it. A message. A warning. A threat. And then, just like that, they were gone. No dramatic exit. No sudden sprint. They simply turned and walked out of frame, vanishing into the night. By the time the police arrived, my hands were numb from gripping my phone too tightly. I met them at the door, breathless, adrenaline still surging through my veins. Their flashlights cut through the darkness as they combed through the yard, but after several minutes, they found nothing. No footprints. No broken locks. No sign that anyone had even been there. I showed them the footage, expecting them to react the way I had, to see what I had seen and understand the sheer wrongness of it. But their faces remained impassive. Could be a vagrant, one officer said with a shrug. Someone passing through. Probably harmless. Let us know if they come back. I wanted to scream. Harmless? Did that figure look harmless? Did their eerie, calculated movement seem like someone who had simply lost their way? I barely slept that night. Every tiny creak of the house made my skin crawl. Every shifting shadow outside my window felt like a pair of unseen eyes watching, waiting. But it wasn't until the next morning that true terror set in. I stepped onto my back porch, hesitant, my pulse thudding in my ears. And there, sitting neatly at my doorstep, was the object. The thing the figure had been holding up for the camera. A crumpled piece of paper. With shaking hands, I picked it up and smoothed it out. The paper was old, damp from the night air, the ink smudged but still legible. A single, chilling sentence scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting. I'll be back. I packed my bags and moved out the next week. I didn't wait to find out what would happen if they kept their promise. Story 5. The coffee shop had always been my little escape, a familiar haven where the world melted into the rhythmic hum of conversation, the comforting clatter of cups, and the low hiss of the espresso machine. I had just settled into my usual corner, cradling the warmth of my coffee between my hands, when I felt it. A presence. It wasn't immediate, just a slow, creeping awareness that someone was watching me. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was nothing more than a trick of my overactive mind, but then I looked up. A man stood nearby, staring directly at me. His gaze was unwavering, his posture too still, too deliberate. A shiver traced my spine. I didn't recognize him. Maybe late 30s, sharp features, casual but somehow out of place, like an actor blending into a scene but not quite fitting the role. I expected him to move on, to pass by like any other stranger in a crowded cafe, but instead, he smiled. And then he said my name. Hearing it from an unfamiliar mouth sent a jolt through me, as if I had been doused in cold water. I blinked at him, my fingers tightening around my coffee cup. It's been a while, he said, his voice warm, too familiar. How have you been? I hesitated. Something about the way he spoke unsettled me. There was no doubt in his voice, no hesitation, no uncertainty. He spoke as though he knew me, as though our meeting was inevitable. I'm sorry, I said slowly. Do I know you? His smile faltered just slightly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Confusion? Disappointment? Of course you do, he said, letting out a soft chuckle, as if I were playing a joke. We met a few months ago. At that thing, you remember, don't you? But I didn't. I was certain I had never seen him before in my life. My mind worked frantically, trying to place him, searching through memories that didn't exist. Mistaken identity, I told myself. That had to be it. I think you have the wrong person, I said, firmer now. He shook his head, his smile thinning. No, no. It was definitely you. You were wearing a black coat, and we talked for a while about. He trailed off, his eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for the right details. But his focus never wavered. I remember everything. A slow, suffocating unease settled over me. I hadn't worn a black coat in months. I hadn't been to any event where I might have met someone like him. And yet, he spoke with such certainty. My coffee sat forgotten on the table as the weight of his words pressed down on me. "I think you're mistaken," I said again, forcing my voice to stay steady. His expression changed. The friendliness drained away, leaving something colder in its place. He studied me in silence for a moment, his eyes searching, dissecting. The light chatter around us seemed to fade into the background, the cafe suddenly too quiet, too suffocating. "You really don't remember me?" he asked, softer now, almost hurt. I shook my head. For a moment, he simply stared, his eyes dark and unreadable. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply, his lips pressing into a thin line. "All right," he said, his tone flat. "Maybe I got it wrong." He turned abruptly and walked away, disappearing into the crowd near the counter. But the tension didn't lift. I felt it lingering in the space he had occupied, thick and oppressive. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scanned the cafe, half expecting to see him watching me from the shadows. But he was gone. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, disturbingly wrong. As I left the coffee shop, the weight of his gaze still clung to me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my breath quickening, my skin prickling with the undeniable sensation of being watched. The streets were alive with people, rushing through their lives, oblivious to the creeping paranoia that now infected mine. That night, I double-checked my locks. Then triple-checked them. I told myself it was fine, that he was just some confused man who had mistaken me for someone else. But I knew better. Days passed. He never reappeared. And yet, the unease didn't fade. The memory of his face, the way he had looked at me, the certainty in his voice, they haunted me. I started noticing things, the way my name seemed to echo a second too long when called in public, the way my reflection in shop windows felt off, as though someone else should have been standing beside me. Then came the whispers. The feeling of eyes on me when I was alone. The phone calls that would ring just once before cutting off. And then, one night, a message. A simple text, from an unknown number. "You were wearing a black coat." I wasn't mistaken. He knew exactly who I was. Story 6. The first time I saw the plain white envelope in my mailbox, I barely thought about it. No return address. No stamp. Just my name written in careful, almost delicate handwriting. I assumed it was a mistake, or maybe junk mail. But when I picked it up, something about the weight felt wrong. Too light, yet somehow deliberate, as if whoever had sent it had chosen its contents with purpose. I took it inside, locking the door behind me out of habit. At the kitchen table, I slid my finger under the flap and peeled it open. There was no letter, no card, not even a slip of paper, just an empty envelope. Confused, I tilted it toward the light, and that's when I saw them. Faint, indented pen marks. Words. A message hidden just beneath the surface. My stomach nodded as I squinted, making out the details. It was my commute. Every turn, every stoplight, the exact time I left in the morning and when I arrived at my destination. The street names, even the small detours I sometimes took to avoid construction or grab coffee. It was all there, written in neat black ink, precise and methodical. My breath hitched. No one should know this. I hadn't shared my daily routine with anyone, hadn't even thought much about it myself, it was just habit. The realization crawled over my skin like 1,000 tiny spiders, someone had been watching me. Following me. Memorizing my every move. I fumbled for my phone, snapping a picture of the envelope. Evidence. Though of what, I wasn't sure yet. My first instinct was to dismiss it as some kind of sick joke, but the detail, the accuracy, made that impossible. This wasn't random. It was intentional. I went to the window, carefully pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The street looked the same as it always did, quiet, unremarkable. But now, it felt different. Hostile. The familiar houses and parked cars suddenly seemed like hiding places. For what, or for who, I couldn't say. I double-checked the locks on my doors. Then the windows. Then again. My home, my sanctuary, no longer felt safe. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house made my heart pound. Every gust of wind against the window sounded like someone standing just outside. I kept checking my phone, half expecting another message. Another sign that whoever had sent the envelope was still out there. But the night passed in silence, thick and suffocating. The next morning, I debated changing my route, but something in me resisted. If I altered my routine, they'd know. They'd notice. And that thought terrified me even more. Instead, I followed the same path, but I paid attention this time. I checked my mirrors obsessively, searching for a familiar car, a lingering presence. Nothing. Everything looked normal. Still, the unease clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. When I got home that evening, my breath caught in my throat. Another envelope. Identical to the first. Sitting in my mailbox, waiting for me. My hands shook as I tore it open, dreading what I'd find. This time, the message inside wasn't just about my commute. It described my day in unsettling detail. The exact time I left the house. The moments I checked my rearview mirror. The slight hesitation I had before pulling into my driveway. Every doubt, every flicker of paranoia I'd felt, it was all there. They weren't just following me. They were inside my head. Watching my fear unfold in real time. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. This wasn't just about tracking my movements anymore. This was about control. Power. And it was working. That night, I finally called the police. I reported everything, the envelopes, the writing, the impossible precision of it all. The officer on the line was polite, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice. A prank, he suggested. Maybe someone messing with me. We'll keep an eye on your neighborhood, he assured me, but it was clear this wasn't a priority. For weeks, I lived in a constant state of dread. Every day, I braced for another envelope. But none came. Slowly, I began to convince myself that it was over. That whoever had done this had moved on. I changed my habits anyway. I altered my routes, kept my curtains drawn, even installed security cameras around my house. Just in case. Months passed. The fear dulled but never disappeared completely. I told myself I was safe. That I had taken control back. But sometimes, late at night, I'd check the cameras. And sometimes, I'd see something. A shadow shifting just beyond the frame. The briefest glint of headlights lingering at the end of my street before disappearing into the darkness. No more envelopes had come. But I knew, deep down, that whoever had sent them hadn't forgotten me. They were still out there. Watching. Waiting. Story 7. The hum of the engine was the only sound as I drove along the lonely stretch of highway. It was late, too late. The kind of late where the world feels like it's holding its breath, where the darkness presses in like something alive, something watching. The road stretched ahead, an unbroken ribbon of asphalt, flanked by looming trees that swallowed the moonlight. I was alone out here. Just me, my car, and the soft murmur of the radio, an old song playing like a lullaby in the emptiness. I reached for the dial, adjusting it slightly, though the station was already clear. The moment my fingers brushed against it, the music cut out. A sharp, grating static filled the car, buzzing through the speakers like angry insects. My pulse stuttered as I glanced at the radio display. The station hadn't changed. The signal hadn't shifted. And yet, it was gone. Then, beneath the static, something else stirred. A voice. It crackled through the distortion, uneven, distant. At first, the words were impossible to make out, buried beneath the static like whispers lost in a storm. But then, I realized, I knew what it was saying. It was saying my name. Slow. Deliberate. Over and over again. A cold shiver crept up my spine as I tightened my grip on the wheel. I stole a glance at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, something, sitting in the back seat. But the car was empty. The road behind me stretched into the abyss, as silent and desolate as the one ahead. The voice didn't stop. It only grew more garbled, more insistent. I turned the volume all the way down. The voice remained. I pressed the power button. The display went dark. The radio shut off. But the voice kept whispering my name. My breath came faster, louder in the suffocating stillness of the car. The voice changed, warping, shifting. The static twisted into something almost like laughter, a broken, jagged sound that crawled beneath my skin. I slammed my foot on the gas. The trees blurred past, shadows stretching and twisting in my peripheral vision. The faster I went, the louder the laughter grew, like something unseen was right there with me, matching my speed, closing in. My knuckles turned white as I yanked the wheel, pulling onto the side of the road. The tires skidded against the pavement, the car jerking to a stop. I threw it into park. My hands trembled as I yanked the keys from the ignition. Silence. But the radio was still on. The static still whispered. And the voice still spoke. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The car was off. The power was gone. And yet, my name hissed through the speakers like a secret meant only for me. I reached for the door handle, but before I could pull it. Click. The locks engaged. My heart nearly stopped. I yanked at the handle. It wouldn't budge. The voice grew sharper, angrier. It wasn't just whispering anymore, it was mocking, laughing, speaking in some language I couldn't understand. But I understood the tone. It wanted me afraid. The temperature dropped so fast my breath fogged up the windshield. A fresh layer of condensation bloomed across the glass, and then something began to write. Slow, deliberate strokes, like an unseen finger tracing through the mist. I see you. The world around me shrank. My pulse roared in my ears. The voice on the radio laughed, a shrill, distorted cackle that rang through the car, filling every inch of space, suffocating me. I pounded on the window. The dashboard. The door. Anything. Nothing changed. The voice kept laughing. The words on the windshield remained. And I was still trapped. Then. Silence. The static cut out. The laughter vanished. And with a quiet click, the locks disengaged. I sat there, paralyzed, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. My hands trembled so violently I could barely grip the keys. I didn't think. I just moved. I shoved the door open and stumbled into the night, cold air rushing against my burning skin. My legs nearly buckled, but I didn't stop. I turned back to the car, expecting, knowing, I would see something inside. But there was nothing. The windshield was clear. The radio was silent. The message was gone. I didn't wait to make sense of it. I got back in. Started the car. Drove. I kept the radio off. But even as the miles stretched on and the sky lightened with the approaching dawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had found me that night. And that it wasn't finished. Not yet. Story 8. It started as nothing, just a small, unremarkable detail in the background of my busy life. The kind of thing you might notice for a second before dismissing it entirely. A dark gray sedan, parked a few spaces away from my office. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then I saw it again. That evening, near my apartment building. It was just a car, I told myself. just another vehicle on a crowded city street. People lived on routines, and maybe whoever owned it had a schedule similar to mine. But something about it gnawed at me, a whisper of unease that I couldn't quite silence. The next morning, the car was there again, this time outside the gym. My stomach twisted as I walked past, my pulse quickening for reasons I couldn't explain. I hesitated at the door, glancing over my shoulder, waiting for some kind of confirmation that I wasn't imagining things. But there was nothing. No movement. No sign of anyone inside. Just those dark, tinted windows, reflecting the pale morning light like vacant, watching eyes. I told myself it was a coincidence. That I was being paranoid. That's what I wanted to believe. And yet, as the hours passed, I found myself scanning every street, every parking lot. I drove home from work, making my usual stop at the grocery store, my thoughts running in anxious circles. When I finally pulled into my driveway, a sharp chill ran through me. The sedan was there. A few houses down. Parked beneath the dim glow of a street lamp, its shadow stretching long and still across the pavement. It wasn't facing my home. It wasn't doing anything. But it was there. I told myself it was fine. Maybe even normal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, I decided to test it. I left work at an unusual time, took a different route, stopped at a coffee shop I rarely visited. I parked at the far end of the lot, pretending to be relaxed as I sipped my drink and watched the entrance in the reflection of the cafe window. Then, I saw it. The car, parked at the edge of the lot. Not close enough to be obvious, but angled slightly toward me, like a predator waiting for the right moment. I couldn't see inside. The windows were too dark. Too opaque. My fingers trembled as I pulled out my phone, typing the license plate number into a note. I had no idea what I would do with it, but it felt like something. Like proof. I stayed longer than usual, hoping that when I walked outside, the car would be gone. It wasn't. That night, I barely slept. Every distant engine, every creak of the floorboards made my heart hammer against my ribs. Shadows flickered against my bedroom wall, stretching and shifting like silent figures just out of sight. When morning came, I could still feel the weight of my unease pressing into my chest. I needed to tell someone. A friend listened patiently as I recounted everything, their expression hovering somewhere between concern and skepticism. Maybe it's just a coincidence, they offered. Maybe it belongs to a neighbor, or someone with a similar schedule. I nodded. I wanted to believe them. But my gut told me otherwise. The days blurred together. Sometimes, the car would vanish for a while, and I'd let myself breathe, convincing myself it was over. But then it would appear again, parked near my workplace, lingering outside my building in the dead of night. Each time, my pulse would spike, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I thought about going to the police. But what would I say? That a car happened to be in the same places as me? Without proof of something more, I doubted they'd take me seriously. Then, one evening, I saw it again, just a few blocks from my apartment. I don't know what came over me, but something inside me snapped. I was done feeling like prey. I approached the car, heart pounding, my phone clutched tightly in one hand. My breaths were shallow, my palms slick with sweat. As I neared, a thick silence settled around me. The air felt different, charged, expectant. The car was empty. No driver. No movement. Just an unassuming vehicle, sitting in eerie stillness. I stepped closer, peering inside, searching for something, anything, that might explain why this car kept appearing in my life. Then, I felt it. A presence. Not inside the car, but somewhere near me. Watching. A prickling sensation crept up my spine, cold and insidious. My breath hitched as I spun around, my pulse hammering in my ears. But the street was empty. No movement. Just parked cars and the faint rustle of a stray cat darting into the shadows. I ran home, my skin crawling with the sensation of unseen eyes boring into me. I double-locked the door, checked the windows, then checked them again. That night, sleep was impossible. Every dream was the same. The car. Looming. Waiting. Watching. By morning, my fear had solidified into resolve. I wasn't going to let this thing, this person, control my life. I took the license plate number to the police, my voice steady even as my hands trembled. They listened, though I could see the doubt in their eyes. "We'll look into it," they said, but their tone was cautious, measured. Like they didn't expect to find anything. Days passed. The car was gone. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. Maybe it really was over. Then, one evening, there was a knock at my door. A sharp, decisive rap that made my stomach drop. I peered through the peephole, my breath caught in my throat. A police officer stood on my doorstep, their face grave. "We found him," they said. "The car's owner. A man with a history of stalking. They had arrested him earlier that day. And in his possession, they had found something. A notebook. Inside were pages filled with details about my life, my name, my workplace, my address. My favorite coffee shop. The routes I took home. The times I left for work. I heard the officer's words, felt their reassurance that I was safe now. But I wasn't. Because even though they had caught him, even though the car was gone, the fear wasn't. I changed my routines. Moved to a new apartment. Switched jobs. Anything to erase the feeling that I was being watched. But every time I saw a dark gray sedan on the street, my chest tightened, my breath caught. And the memories came flooding back. Because deep down, I knew, somewhere, out there, someone else was watching. Waiting. Story 9. The notification appeared out of nowhere, a small, unassuming box that popped up in the corner of my laptop screen. "Someone is trying to access your webcam." My breath hitched. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. I blinked, hoping it was some kind of glitch, but the message remained, stark and undeniable. A slow, creeping dread settled in my stomach. I slammed the notification shut, my fingers trembling as I did so. This wasn't supposed to happen. I was careful. I had firewalls, strong passwords, antivirus scans running regularly. I had read stories about hackers breaking into people's devices, hijacking cameras, turning everyday technology into a silent, unblinking eye, but I had always assumed I was safe. I wasn't. A shiver ran down my spine as I reached for the webcam, flipping the cover down with shaking hands. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was just a false alarm, some random software bug, a harmless error. But it didn't feel harmless. It felt like a door had been cracked open, like something had slipped inside while I wasn't looking. I ran a security scan. Nothing. No malware, no suspicious files, just my normal apps, my neatly organized folders. But the message had been real. Someone had tried to access my camera. I spent the next hour obsessively checking every setting, updating my security protocols, enabling firewalls, even covering the camera with a piece of tape just in case. I told myself it was fine. It was over. But the unease lingered. For the next few days, I found myself watching my laptop as if it had turned into something unfamiliar, something I couldn't trust. I kept it closed when I wasn't using it, avoided video calls, double-checked the webcam cover a dozen times a day. And yet, the feeling never left, that gnawing, skin-crawling sensation of being watched. Then, it happened again. Another notification. But this time, the message was different. "I'm waiting." I froze. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier, suffocating. My heart pounded against my ribs as I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. It wasn't just an attempted breach. It was a message. A direct, deliberate message. Someone was watching. And now, they wanted me to know. Panic surged through me. I shut my laptop, practically throwing it across the table as if I could physically push the intruder away. My hands were clammy, my breath coming in short gasps. I had to do something. I called tech support, hoping they would have answers. But they dismissed it, waving it off as a glitch, a minor security hiccup. It's probably nothing, they said. It didn't feel like nothing. That night, I barely slept. Every shadow in my room felt wrong, every creak of the house sent adrenaline surging through my veins. The thought that someone, somewhere, had been peering through my camera, watching me in my most unguarded moments, made my skin crawl. I spent the next day reinstalling my operating system, resetting all my passwords, installing every security program I could find. I told myself it was over. I had locked all the doors, sealed every crack. But then, late that evening, something happened that shattered any illusion of safety I had left. I was in the living room, my laptop closed on the desk, powered off. Or at least, it was supposed to be. Then, in the silence, I heard it. That familiar chime. The sound of my laptop turning on. My blood turned to ice. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The screen was glowing, the soft blue light casting eerie shadows across the room. It was on. But I hadn't touched it. Dread clawed its way up my spine as I stepped closer, my legs numb beneath me. The webcam cover was still in place. But on the screen, another message had appeared. I'm waiting. And underneath it, a new addition. I know you can see me. A wave of nausea rolled through me. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, but all I could do was stand there, frozen in place, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. They knew. They knew I had seen their messages. They knew I had been avoiding my laptop, that I had been covering the camera, trying to shut them out. And worst of all, they didn't care. The realization sent a fresh bolt of terror through me. This wasn't just some hacker playing games. This was personal. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I reached out to a professional cybersecurity expert, someone who knew how to track threats like this. When they accessed my system, what they found made my stomach drop. Deep inside my laptop was a hidden program. A sophisticated piece of spyware, buried so well that my previous scans had missed it entirely. It had been running for weeks. They had been watching me for weeks. Through my camera. Through my microphone. Even pulling files from my system. They had seen everything. My stomach churned. My skin prickled with disgust, with fear, with the sickening realization of how vulnerable I had been. The expert removed the malware, secured my system, assured me that the intruder was gone. But the fear never left. Even now, months later, every time I sit in front of my laptop, I feel it. The unease. The paranoia. The memory of that message. I'm waiting. A reminder that no matter how secure I think I am, no matter how many precautions I take, there is always someone watching. Waiting. Just out of sight. Story 10. I had been driving for hours, the endless stretch of highway blurring into monotony. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement had become almost hypnotic, lulling me into a drowsy haze. My body ached from sitting too long, my neck stiff, my fingers tense around the wheel. I needed a break. Just a quick stop to stretch my legs, maybe grab a cup of coffee, something to keep me awake for the rest of the drive. When I saw the dimly lit rest stop ahead, I didn't hesitate. It was one of those isolated places, the kind you barely notice until you need it. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a couple of other cars sitting in the shadows, their owners nowhere in sight. I pulled in, cut the engine, and stepped out, the cool night air wrapping around me. The building itself was unremarkable, just a tired-looking structure with flickering fluorescent lights casting an eerie glow through the glass windows. As I pushed open the heavy door, it let out a long, drawn-out creak. The smell of stale coffee and cheap disinfectant filled the air. There were a few people inside, but the place felt still. Too still. And then, I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the room, tall and unmoving. His coat hung loosely around him, and his hair was unkempt, as if he'd been standing there for hours, untouched by time. But it was his eyes that stopped me cold. He wasn't browsing the vending machines, wasn't looking at his phone or staring into space like a normal, tired traveler. He was staring at me. Directly at me. His gaze was unwavering, sharp, and deliberate. He didn't blink. He didn't shift. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe he was looking past me, lost in thought. I made my way to the counter, ordered my coffee, and deliberately avoided glancing in his direction. But I could feel it, his eyes, still locked onto me, burning into the side of my face. When I finally turned my head, just for a second, my stomach twisted. He hadn't moved an inch. Still standing there. Still watching. A cold unease settled over me, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck rise. My fingers tightened around my coffee cup as I forced myself to focus on something else. Anything else. But no matter how much I tried to brush it off, the weight of his gaze pressed down on me, making my skin crawl. I drank my coffee faster than I should have, the bitter liquid doing nothing to shake the feeling growing in my chest. The moment I emptied the cup, I knew I needed to leave. Now. As casually as I could, I stood up, grabbed my keys, and walked toward the door, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. With each step, the unease clawed at me, urging me to move faster. I reached the door and hesitated for just a second before stepping out into the night. The cold air should have been refreshing, but instead, it sent a deeper chill down my spine. Something made me glance over my shoulder. There he was. He hadn't moved from his spot, but now he was even closer to the glass, his face nearly pressed against it. His eyes never wavered. Never blinked. The fluorescent lights behind him flickered, casting strange shadows across his gaunt face. I fumbled for my car door, hands shaking as I yanked it open. My breath came fast, too fast. I got in, slammed the lock down, and jammed the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I forced myself to check the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing just outside, inches from my car. But he wasn't there. The parking lot was empty. The doorway was empty. I swallowed hard, my pulse still racing. Maybe he'd moved away. Maybe it had all been in my head. But as I pulled onto the highway, that creeping dread refused to leave me. The rest of the drive, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head, his stare, his stillness, the feeling that he wasn't just looking at me, but through me. And the worst part? I'll never know what he wanted. I never stopped at that rest stop again. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving alone, I get the uneasy sense that somewhere, in the distance, someone is watching. And I pray I never see those eyes again,